Welcome to Paskvan Podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps this channel. Today we are stepping back into a really pivotal but also deeply unsettling chapter of American history. We're talking about the late 19th century.
It's a time that was defined by this almost frantic pace of modernization.
Right, but at the same time, it was clouded by this deep, almost dangerous level of social anonymity.
And our setting for this exploration is Chicago.
A city that was, still structurally defined by the trauma of the 1871 Great Fire, but was also just emotionally obsessed with progress, with expansion.
And that obsession, that's really the key to what we're looking into today. We're doing a detailed exploration of how a city built on this promise of, rapid reinvention.
And fueled by this almost uncritical trust.
Exactly. How that became the absolute perfect environment for exploitation. We're examining the collected accounts surrounding a man named Herman Webster Mudgett.
The man who later became known as H.H. Holmes.
And we're looking at the disturbing physical structure he engineered. A labyrinth designed specifically to capitalize on the chaos leading up to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition.
The building itself is practically a character in this narrative, isn't it? It's not enough to simply say a destructive person did bad things.
Not at all.
This is more of a forensic study of architectural deception. Of engineering that was applied purely for control, for the containment of human beings.
It really is.
And it asks this very uncomfortable question of how someone who managed to project such an air of respectability could operate a systematic enterprise of harm and fraud right under the nose of a burgeoning metropolis.
It serves as a profound case study in the power of appearances to neutralize basic caution. We're looking at the fusion of confidence, calculated intelligence, and architectural planning.
All for highly destructive ends.
All for highly destructive ends, yes. And this whole system was allowed to function during a moment of just supreme civic ambition and optimism. For you, the listener, understanding the environment is absolutely essential to understanding the audacity of the whole operation.
So to really start this exploration, we need to set the stage. What did Chicago actually look and feel like in those last decades of the 19th century? You said it wasn't just a city.
It was less a city and more a roaring industrial experiment. The archival descriptions, they paint a really visceral picture. It was a city that was just constantly in motion.
You can almost smell it, can't you?
You can. If you looked up, you would see smoke rising continuously from factory stacks. It was a visible testament to this relentless round-the-clock production. And then below, the rail lines were the lifeblood.
Like veins.
An intricate, dense network stitching together commerce, raw materials, and critically, the continuous influx of people.
And the sources really emphasize that human tide pouring in. Thousands upon thousands of immigrants, job seekers, entrepreneurs. They arrived with what? Very little.
Very little. Often just the promise that Chicago offered. It was the ultimate destination for self-reinvention.
So the desire to shed your past was strong there.
Incredibly strong. In Chicago, you weren't judged by where you came from. You were judged by the confidence you displayed and the money you appeared to possess.
It sounds loud, dirty.
Loud, dirty, fiercely ambitious. But the most important characteristic for our story, for Mudgett's purposes, was its dangerous anonymity.
If you arrived alone, you were just another face in the crowd.
Another anonymous figure in this overwhelming crowd of opportunity seekers. Completely invisible.
And this rapid growth in anonymity, it wasn't just organic, was it? It was accelerated by that catastrophic 1871 fire.
That event, ironically, created the conditions for this unbridled expansion. The fire acted like a reset button.
But instead of slowing things down, it just hit fast forward.
It hyper-accelerated it. The post-fire rebuilding led to a construction boom that was often just poorly regulated. The sources confirmed buildings went up incredibly fast. Speed was the priority.
Not compliant.
Not at all. Regulations were loose, inspection was cursory at best, and corruption was a known element of the city's political machinery.
Which means money flowed freely.
Very freely. If a man appeared intelligent, spoke with confidence, and presented himself well, he was granted access. There was just no time to question your background or check every financial ledger.
It was a system designed to reward appearance and ambition.
Precisely. Historians call it the era of unquestioning expansion. If you could afford the land and hire the workers, you could build practically anything you wished. This environment was the perfect crucible for a chameleon like Holmes to thrive in.
And this entire dynamic, the ambition, the transient population, the lack of scrutiny, it was all set to climax with the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition.
The exposition was just monumental. It wasn't just a trade show. It was Chicago's. And you could argue America's announcement to the global stage.
We're here. We're a modern industrial power.
That was the message. It was intended to be the white city, a shining beacon of progress. But it created a shadow, the gray city, where exploitation could flourish.
And millions of visitors were expected. The scale is just staggering when you think about the infrastructure challenge.
He was an economic magnet. Hotels were instantly overwhelmed, booked solid months in advance, and this required a massive influx of temporary short-term workers.
People who weren't putting down roots.
Exactly. And critically, these were often single travelers. Young women seeking new opportunities or independence, arriving alone, trusting strangers, and needing lodging in these transitional, less supervised neighborhoods.
So you have this absolute tidal wave of transient humanity, a demographic that police and authorities would find nearly impossible to track or verify.
It's the ideal cover. The sheer volume of people meant that the disappearance of one person, or even several, from a boarding house or a temporary job would be so easily overlooked amid the city's administrative chaos.
Chicago became the perfect hunting ground.
The perfect environment for someone who understood how to exploit the fundamental human needs for trust, for temporary work, and for affordable lodging. The anonymity of the many protected the actions of the few.
So now we have to introduce the central figure onto this chaotic stage, Herman Webster Mudgett. And the image we have of him, it just utterly contradicts the subsequent accounts of his actions.
He was born into relative respectability in New Hampshire. The accounts consistently stress his high level of education, his articulate manner of speaking, and his exceptional, almost clinical intelligence.
He consciously cultivated an image, didn't he?
He did. The image of the successful, proper Victorian gentleman. Clean-cut, well-spoken, polite, everything society at the time admired.
And his training wasn't just academic. It gave him highly specific utilitarian skills for what he would do later. He studied medicine and chemistry.
That knowledge was the foundational tool for his entire system. He understood anatomy, the mechanics of the human frame. He possessed knowledge of pharmaceuticals and, more broadly, corrosive chemicals. He understood how the body failed.
And he paired that with a certain demeanor.
A charming, calm, and outwardly soothing demeanor. This allowed him to blend effortlessly into the professional class while maintaining this profound internal detachment.
And the sources show a crucial pattern emerged long before he ever set foot in Illinois. He was already using his medical training for fraud while he was still in school.
Yes. While he was attending medical school in Michigan, he was involved in these sophisticated insurance fraud schemes. And this wasn't petty larceny.
No, this was methodical.
Very methodical. It involved the careful disfigurement of cadavers, often ones he had access to through his training, which were then falsely identified as victims of accidents. This allowed him to collect policy money that was already in place.
Which reveals a cold, calculated approach to profiting from human remains very early on.
Very early on.
Yeah.
And his classmates, they often remarked on his unsettling comfort level around human remains.
How so?
Well, the accounts specify that he treated the cadavers not with the reverence you'd expect from a future medical professional, but purely as tools, as instruments to be manipulated for financial gain.
That's a profound detachment.
It's perhaps the most chilling early indicator. It shows this transactional worldview where human life and what remains of it was simply a resource.
And this pattern of fraud and sudden departures, it followed him. He left this trail of suspicion, but never any proof.
That was his method, always moving on before questions could solidify into proven accusations. Rumors followed him everywhere, vanished business partners, women who had placed their trust in him, and then subsequently disappeared across various locales.
So, always a cloud of suspicion, but never a prosecutable trail.
Never. He understood that in a transient society, lack of proof equals freedom.
So arriving in Chicago, he needed to cement that respectable professional identity. Herman Webster Mudgett had to vanish completely.
Replaced by the reassuring, authoritative name, H.H. Holmes. The rebranding was a calculated, strategic move to project stability and trust. H.H. Holmes sounds like a man of means, of permanence.
And he chose the Inglewood neighborhood.
A rapidly developing area south of the city center. It perfectly aligned with his image as an aspiring businessman.
And he immediately sought to establish a legitimate front. He started working at a local pharmacy, right? Owned by an elderly couple. How quickly did he establish community confidence?
Instantly. He was attentive, knowledgeable, he knew his customers by name. He made them feel secure in their transactions. He presented the perfect image of a local, respected, and successful pharmacist. That pharmacy was more than a business. It was his psychological anchor in the community.
And then the sequence of events that repeated his past pattern began again with the owners.
First, the husband experienced a debilitating illness and then his subsequent passing. The accounts detailing the circumstances were vague, and in the chaos of Chicago, no one pursued extensive questioning.
And the wife?
The wife soon experienced a similar fate. And crucially, the sources emphasized that no official investigation or autopsy was conducted in either case. It just reflects the loose scrutiny of the era.
And Holmes's explanation, once again, was designed to diffuse any suspicion.
It was a perfectly designed cover story for a fast-moving city. He claimed he purchased the pharmacy from the wife before her passing, and that she simply moved away afterward.
And people bought it.
They did. People disappeared all the time. So Holmes now had full control of his base of operations, which provided a legitimate storefront, a steady income stream, and, critically, unchallenged access to the various chemical and pharmaceutical supplies he needed for his next phase.
So with the pharmacy secured, Holmes immediately starts the project that would immortalize him. He buys the land directly across the street. This is the real conception of the entire systematic operation.
It really is. And it wasn't just construction. It was an elaborate piece of operational security masquerading as a building project. The sources detail how the construction of this large three-story structure was defined by deliberate confusion, by pervasive secrecy.
It wasn't incompetence then.
No, this was engineering designed to prevent comprehension.
So how did he manage to build something so strange in such a dense urban environment without drawing immediate suspicion?
By never allowing anyone to see the whole picture. He constantly changed the construction plans mid-project. Walls would be framed only to be torn down days later. Doorways would be opened and then sealed with brick.
Which would just create logistical chaos. The workers would blame it on, what? The owner's eccentricity.
Exactly. Eccentricity or poor planning, not malicious intent. And on top of that, he constantly rotated his workforce.
Which was the strategic masterstroke.
Yeah, absolutely. He used dozens of different contractors for different sections, cycling them through quickly. And the core reason, the accounts show, was that he frequently dismissed workers before they could complete their assignment or fully understand the structural layout.
So no single person, from the framer to the plumber, ever possessed the complete blueprint of the finished maze.
That's it. If the roofers only knew the attic and the foundation workers only knew the basement, they could never piece together the structure's terrifying functionality. Each worker only saw an incomplete, confusing puzzle piece.
And his financial dealings during this period, they were also part of the plan.
They were designed both for economy and for preventing oversight. Payment disputes were common. He constantly argued invoices, delayed wages. He generally behaved like a meticulous yet difficult businessman.
Why introduce all that conflict? It seems counterintuitive.
The conflict served a purpose beyond just saving money. It ensured a constant rotation of frustrated, short-term contractors who were focused entirely on receiving their overdue wages or arguing specific contract details.
So their attention was on the ledger, not the building.
Precisely. Their attention was localized to the financial side, not the structural integrity or the strange placement of piping or walls. They were too busy pursuing payment to scrutinize his motives.
And to the city, though, the exterior was deliberately unassuming.
It had to be. It presented itself as an affordable, respectable lodging option near the high-traffic exposition grounds.
Yeah.
The facade was vital to his system. It had to blend into the boom-era architecture of Englewood.
But its underlying purpose was singular.
Singular, to attract and process single, transient people, temporary workers, visitors, and critically, young women seeking a degree of independence who had come to Chicago alone for the promise of the fair.
And he used his persona as this trustworthy, successful businessman to lower the guards of these newcomers. This is where the foundation of the operation lay, right? The calculated deployment of trust.
He offered employment, lodging, and perceived security in a city widely known for its dangers. He was the anchor they needed. But the entry fee for that apparent security was immediate paperwork.
The fine print that cost them their autonomy.
That's exactly it. Tenants and employees were routinely required to sign various contracts, and these often included insurance policies, naming Holmes as the primary beneficiary.
How did he frame that? How did he sell it?
He framed it as standard business procedure, or collateral against rent, or even as necessary protection in a dangerous city. And because of his calm and respectable demeanor, people they signed the documents. They unknowingly transitioned from paying tenants to literal financial assets on Holmes's balance sheet.
So once an individual crossed that threshold and stepped into the upper floors of the structure, the illusion of a normal hotel was just systematically shattered.
It was. The primary architectural objective was psychological, to disorient the guest.
The entire upper structure was engineered to be a maze.
Imagine the confusing effect. Rooms where conventional logic dictated they shouldn't exist. Hallways that twisted unexpectedly or just doubled back on themselves. You'd find doors opening straight into solid brick walls, or sealed off, or even opening onto thin air.
And the sheer audacity of this plan hinged on Chicago's reputation for haste. The genius of it, if you can call it that, was that guests would simply dismiss these oddities as the result of rushed, post-fire, chaotic construction.
Which was a common feature of the city. They blamed the architectural flaws on the city's speed and the contractor's incompetence, never suspecting the owner's malicious intent.
So we have to reiterate this. The confusion was not a design flaw.
It was the structural intent. A confused person cannot find their way out, and an isolated person cannot seek help.
And that isolation was amplified by what you call the architecture of silence.
Yes, the accounts detail specific measures taken to ensure isolation. Certain rooms were meticulously soundproofed. This involved layering thick materials, plaster of Paris, packed felt, multiple layers of brick designed specifically to absorb sound.
And he marketed this as a premium feature for privacy.
Of course, but its undeniable purpose was to ensure that no sound, no cry for help, no struggle could escape that room and be heard by a neighboring guest or a passerby on the street.
So once the guest was contained, how did Holmes maintain this absolute invisible control within his maze?
That control was achieved through concealed infrastructure. Hidden staircases were integrated into the walls, allowing him to move rapidly and stealthily throughout the building, appearing and disappearing at will without using the main tenant stairways.
And then the trapdoors?
Numerous trapdoors installed beneath rugs and floorboards. They served as swift, silent, hidden methods of entry or exit, particularly linking the hotel floors to the utility sections below.
And then we come to the most chilling, specialized features of all, the chutes.
The structure incorporated multiple chutes running vertically from the upper residential floors directly down to the secured basement. Some were narrow, plausible for refuse or laundry to maintain the illusion of utility.
But not all of them.
No. The accounts clearly describe other chutes that were wider, designed precisely for the rapid and silent descent of a human form into the dread below. This was the final architectural transition point.
And the structural design even facilitated the silent termination of life inside those contained rooms.
This is where his knowledge of chemistry and engineering really converged. The system of coal gas lines within the building, they ran in highly unusual, circuitous ways. And crucially, specific sealed rooms contained valves that were only controllable from outside the locked door.
Often situated in his own private access passages.
Yes, meaning he could essentially deploy an agent of termination remotely.
While the gas lines were claimed to be for, lighting? Heating?
Conventional lighting or heating. Again, a plausible explanation for the era. But witnesses later testified that the system could be used to slowly and silently release gas into those sealed, soundproof chambers,
allowing him to induce suffocation or unconsciousness without any signs of forceful entry or struggle.
Which would allow the act to appear, perhaps, as a sudden, unexplained illness or a failure to wake.
And the inevitable destination for everything unseen was the dread below, the basement. What did investigators find in this space that so few people ever saw?
This was the functional heart of the entire system. It was a laboratory of erasure and processing. The space was secured and specially fitted with massive vats, which accounts confirm were filled with corrosive chemicals alongside large piles of quicklime.
All materials designed for accelerating biological decomposition.
It sounded like an industrial processing plant, not a hotel cellar. And it was exactly that. Accounts detail surgical tables confirming his medical background was operational here, racks of specialized tools, and most tellingly, a furnace.
And this was no ordinary furnace.
No. This was powerful enough to reduce substantial remains to ash. Holmes's intimate knowledge of acids, chemistry, and anatomy gave him the unparalleled capacity to dissolve flesh and bone and completely eliminate any evidence of the people who had vanished from upstairs.
So the entire building, from the trusting entryway to the quiet basement erasure, was a seamless loop of calculated consumption.
It was.
What elevates this beyond just isolated acts and makes it truly disturbing is the systematic nature of it all. I mean, he didn't see these acts of harm as simple malice. He transformed them into commerce.
A highly refined, two-tiered business model, blending financial fraud and operational concealment.
Yes. The intentional termination of life became simply a guaranteed return on investment.
And the insurance mechanism was foundational to this commerce. As we established, employees and associates were required to take out life policies, frequently naming Holmes as the sole beneficiary. In many instances, he bypassed their input entirely, paying the premiums himself.
So he was literally investing capital into the guaranteed final moments of the people around him. But how did the insurance companies of the 1890s allow this level of manipulation?
It was really a confluence of factors relating to the era's financial technology. The insurance market in the 1890s just lacked sophisticated underwriting processes. There were no centralized databases to track individuals taking out multiple policies or to flag unusual beneficiary designations.
So if a policy was certified by an apparently respectable businessman like Holmes,
And the premiums were paid promptly, the transaction was typically processed without any deeper scrutiny, he just exploited this administrative blind spot perfectly.
and to keep this business model secure, he had to introduce inconsistency into the destructive acts, right, to avoid a pattern emerging.
That variance was critical operational security. If all the procedures that resulted in the loss of life looked the same, a pattern would eventually be visible to authorities. So he varied the methods,
Gotcha.
administering slow-acting pharmaceutical agents that simulated natural illness, inducing prolonged confinement and deprivation leading to a drawn-out deterioration, or the silent, swift procedure utilizing the gas system.
This variation ensured that connecting the separate incidents became incredibly difficult for any investigator trying to retroactively analyze the situation.
It did. And after the inevitable termination, the basement factory had a dual function, leading to two separate profit streams, which just speaks volumes about his cynical mindset.
The first and most crucial was complete erasure.
Right. This involved stripping away any identifying features, using the vats and the quicklime to chemically treat the flesh and bone, and finally burning any remaining organic matter in that large furnace. This eliminated the evidence, protecting the ongoing enterprise.
But the second profit stream, that linked back to his medical expertise. He treated the remains not just as evidence to be destroyed, but as a valuable commodity.
Precisely. The anatomy education market was expanding rapidly in the late 19th century, creating high demand for study specimens, particularly high-quality articulated skeletons.
So Holmes, leveraging his medical background and his connections.
Or those of his associates, yes. He meticulously cleaned and prepared the bones. He then sold these resulting skeletons to medical schools as legitimate educational specimens.
So he was monetizing his associates and guests not once through the insurance payout, but a second time by selling their physical remains to the very institutions that trained him.
It's the ultimate expression of that transactional view of human life. The full financial cycle was acquire the asset, the guest pay the premium, which was the investment, terminate their existence, which was the trigger event, collect the insurance for the primary profit, and then process the remains for the secondary profit.
This systematic operation continued throughout the peak of the World's Fair, but eventually the system had to show stress cracks. Why did he finally have to abandon his carefully constructed building?
The sheer operational complexity was just unsustainable. Employees who were dismissed or shortchanged started talking. Neighbors began to notice the strange, pungent chemical odors that occasionally escaped the basement.
And the smoke.
The unusual smoke patterns late at night, and the frequent large deliveries of acids and corrosive materials. On top of all that, the financial pressure from creditors demanding payment for his labyrinthine building projects began to intensify.
So the end of the exposition meant the city was slowing down and that level of anonymity was starting to decrease.
The spotlight was intensifying. By late 1893, Holmes realized his time was up. He acted quickly, shifting assets, liquidating accounts, and abandoning the structure in Chicago. He left the physical evidence behind, believing he could just disappear into the broader American landscape, as his persona, Herman Webster Mudgett, had successfully done before.
However, this time, the financial threads he left behind proved to be his undoing. The apprehension finally came in Boston in 1894.
And the irony is profound. He was apprehended not for the massive, systematic destruction of human life in Chicago, but for a simple technical charge: insurance fraud.
Specifically related to the Patetzel case.
Yes, it was a mundane financial crime, but it was enough to halt his endless journey and finally allow authorities to start pulling at the threads of his incredibly complicated double life.
Once he was in custody, he started the ultimate act of operational confusion, controlling the narrative through chaos.
The chaos of his confessions became the defining feature of his legacy in the immediate aftermath. He confessed, then he promptly recanted, then he confessed again, wildly shifting the potential count of those whose lives he ended.
At times, he claimed 9 confirmed acts of harm. Other accounts suggested dozens.
And in his most sensational moments, he boasted of over 100.
Why this constant shifting? Was it just a psychological exercise in power over his captors and the public?
Absolutely. He was deliberately blending chillingly precise operational details that actually aligned with the partial physical evidence, with clear, elaborate exaggerations that bordered on fantasy. He reveled in the power of the ensuing confusion.
So for investigators, this created an immediate, agonizing difficulty.
Separating verifiable truth from pure, self-aggrandizing performance. And that difficulty was compounded by the compromised physical evidence back in Chicago.
Right. The structure itself had already been subject to various alterations and abandonment, and critical records were incomplete or purposefully misleading.
And many individuals were categorized simply as missing persons, not officially deceased. Holmes knew that without verifiable remains and without credible witnesses who fully understood his system, the full extent of his destructive acts inside that architecturally altered structure could never be definitively proven.
And the press, seizing on the ambiguity and the sheer architectural horror, immediately began shaping his legacy.
This was the peak era of sensational yellow journalism. The press immediately dubbed him America's first serial annihilator, a concept that perfectly captured the public's fear of a charming modern predator operating within the system.
Newspapers just capitalized on the shock.
They exaggerated details, and they turned the functional structure into the legendary theatrical castle that we hear about today.
The blurring of history and horror was instantaneous.
It was. The accounts confirmed that while some of the building descriptions were rooted in verifiable evidence, the soundproofing, the chutes, many others were fabricated or wildly exaggerated for dramatic effect. The press turned him into an almost inhuman figure, which simplified the complex and unsettling reality that he was, at his core, a highly functioning, well-dressed, charismatic man operating entirely within established social bounds.
And despite the dozens of alleged acts of termination in Chicago, his formal conviction was remarkably narrow and procedural.
His conviction rested primarily on the financial fraud and the taking of one specific life, that of his business associate, Benjamin Petzl. That case could be definitively proven via a clear paper trail, unambiguous financial records, and reliable witness testimony.
The evidence Holmes failed to erase on the financial side of his scheme.
Exactly. The Chicago operations, being based on fluid human remains and unreliable structural evidence, were just too messy to fully substantiate in a court of law.
His final moments in 1896 remain an unsettling chapter in this story.
He maintained an extraordinary degree of composure right up to the end. He displayed no discernible remorse, no emotional response. He continued to offer contradictory, self-serving statements, attempting to externalize the blame by insisting that something fundamental had always been broken inside him.
And the final act itself was not clean.
When the trapdoor was released, the process was not immediate. The accounts noted that he struggled for several minutes before his life ended. Even his final public act lacked a clean conclusion.
And what of the structure itself, the silent accomplice?
The building was extensively damaged by a fire shortly after his apprehension. This led to widespread suspicion of arson, an effort to permanently erase the secrets held within his walls.
Regardless of the cause, the damage was catastrophic.
It was. The structure was subsequently demolished, its bricks carted away, and the terrifying arrangement of its maze-like rooms was erased from the map of the Englewood neighborhood.
So we are left with this fundamental uncertainty that Holmes himself engineered. Due to his meticulous design for operational erasure and his wildly unreliable final confessions, the true scope of the acts committed inside that building will simply never be known.
Never. We're left only with estimates, rumors, and the undeniable facts of systemic fraud and the few proven acts of taking a life.
The crucial step for us now is to look beyond the sensational details, the soundproof rooms, the trapdoors, the chutes, and analyze the societal implications.
The verifiable facts are simple. He committed systematic destructive acts and massive fraud, and he succeeded because he exploited the trust inherent in a city that rewarded ambition and allowed anonymity to flourish.
The ultimate tool, more effective than any soundproofing, was the fact that his charisma silenced all instinctual doubt.
That is the essential lesson. We see how profoundly trust can be manipulated, how fast-growing urban environments prioritize unscrutinized progress over the safety of the transient population, and how a meticulous veneer of respectability can override all logical caution.
People believed him.
They believed him, hired him, and housed with him, because he embodied the success they were all aspiring to achieve in that city.
So the building is gone today. There's no physical monument to warn passersby in Chicago.
But the conditions that allowed it to exist, the profound anonymity, the indifference to the fate of strangers, and the failure to question apparent respectability, have not been eradicated from the modern world. The unsettling realization is that calculated evil does not always announce itself with dramatic villainy. Sometimes it builds quietly, it operates systematically, it smiles politely, and it hides in plain sight, protected by the very structure of ambition it seeks to exploit.
Something to consider long after the demolition crews have finished their work and the papers have been filed away.